This podcast is presented by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
We gave you a little preview in our Tree Grows in Brooklyn podcast, but some conversations are just too good to trim down in editing. So it's time for our first bonus episode.
Hi, Heather. Thank you for inviting me. I'm County Council member and Prince George's County Vice Chair, Deni Taveras. I represent District 2, and in my capacity as Vice Chair, I represent the whole county.
We are thrilled to have you on the podcast today as we take a deep dive into A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. So in the book, the tenements and neighborhood of Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 1912 come to life almost as a distinct character. Betty Smith offers vivid description of the mix of sounds and smells and colors that are part of the multi-ethnic neighborhood Francie lives in. I know you grew up in New York. Does this description ring true or resonate with how you experienced your neighborhood as a child?
Well, in reading the caption, I would say yes and no. We were not as diverse. We as the maybe 1912 Brooklyn, we were basically African Americans and Latinos in where I grew up in Harlem. And I did enjoy the people, the sounds, the music, the smells in terms of the great food that came out of all the restaurants. I mean, there is no shortage of good food in New York at all, even from a hole in the wall. It's like the best food you've ever had. And I just love like the people sitting down playing dominoes, in the middle of the islands in the street on Broadway. And, but I also grew up. So on that's the positive side, right? But on the more negative side, I also grew up in a New York that was also at the height of the crack epidemic and at the height of AIDS. And so we while I saw the children playing, at the water pumps, at the fire hydrants, and that was a lot of fun, and people playing baseball in the middle of the street. It was also real that we had drug dealers standing almost at every single block in all four corners, and the illicit activity happening in a lot of the crack buildings that I grew up in. So you saw the negativity of how that negatively affected communities like mine, the abuse and addiction of drugs and how that drove people to do certain things. And you seeing people shoot up, urinate in buildings, the gun violence that comes with that. And, and so on. And then you see we could talk about the deterioration of some of the affordable housing and the boarded up buildings all around us. So, it was both positive and negative. But for somebody who didn't know better, you always were protected in that sphere if you came from a solid house where you knew you had somebody there every day, at the end of your school day. And so for those that had stable lives, it was a protected environment. You didn't know, like people often say, oh, you didn't know you were poor when you grew up because you had everything you needed. You had your 3 meals. And so those are the kind of things that, you kind of don't sense it. And it's only until you step out and you see from outside and that you're like, oh, wow, I survived that.
It's interesting to hear you say that because I think, in spite of this book being almost 100 years before your childhood, Francie seems to have that same dichotomy. She has this wonderful, strong female set of relatives with her mom and her aunts and her grandmother. but her neighborhood is really struggling with poverty and alcoholism. Francie, actually, a person tries to assault her at one point, and her mother physically has to intervene to protect her. But at the same time, she has these sort of vivid connections to her community, a very rich sensory experience of living there and being part of her neighborhood, which, like you said, the positivity and the negativity, and that's all part of her childhood.
Yeah, they're hand in hand. And it's interesting, you should mention that, because I remember being in precarious situations. There was I remember when I was 12 years old, and I had my family, I had at least 3 or 4 family members that lived all on the same block in different apartments. So it was just me jumping to my grandmother, my aunt, going to my cousins, it was we all lived in the same neighborhood and even in the same building. and I was walking to one of my aunt's places down the street. And I remember that I was in a short t-shirt and shorts. And I remember distinctly this man approaching me, asking me, can I show him where a supermarket was or a grocery store, a bodega? And I'm if you know New York City, there is a bodega at every single corner. You don't need to go anywhere. And then the man was dressed in a fur coat in the summer with this round tip hat, which anybody who's ever read The Pimp knows this is a pimp. But I had never seen that in my life. I had never encountered that. But I knew my spidey sense came on really quick. This is a man you've got to run away from, and you got to get away because this man came to hunt, And so I was streetwise enough to protect myself from that kind of incident or incidents where you sense that somebody was trying to do you harm, sexually molest you or something to that nature, even from trusted individuals in the community. And so in that sense, I was able to always be protective and always be respectful, but at the same time, no, I'm going back home, and that's okay, but thank you, but no. And so I was able, but there are some people whose lives were traumatized because they didn't maybe have the same sense of protection or awareness of what was going on. And so it's sad, but it's real.
Absolutely. Another issue in the book that I wanted to talk to you about is public education. So that's a social issue tackled in the book. Francie initially goes to her neighborhood public school, which Smith describes as, quote, 3,000 children crowded into this ugly, brutalizing school that had facilities for only 1,000. Later on, she sees this other school in a more affluent neighborhood and kind of falls in love with this school. She wants to go there. Her dad falsifies her address so that she can transfer. Does the neighborhood a child grows up in still have impacts on educational outcomes? And how much progress do you think we've made in the last 100 years in terms of equitable access to education?
Now that's a question for you.
Asking the big questions here.
You are. I can share with you my experience in New York. My New York experience was similar in the sense of that we were exceedingly in overcrowded spaces. There was 40, 50 to a class in my high school. In my elementary school, there were so many, and I went to several elementary schools. But I remember in one particular elementary school in the north side of the city where the Dominicans were arriving in thrones, there were so many of us that we had to share one room, both the 4th and 5th grade class together. And I remember distinctly that we had in one classroom, in another school I went to, where I ended up finishing my growing up there in Harlem, that we had a teacher that would make us do things that I mean, for all intents and purposes, were illegal, like kneeling on rice, holding books up in the air, kind of, commando, style. I mean, I'm sure the once found out that the teacher was probably fired, but it was, it's tough because how we were a rambunctious group. I mean, I also remember that in elementary school, I remember that in 5th grade, we were forced to be made to watch a film of the effects of heroin on the community and on certain individuals. Since I saw that movie, I've never been able to look at a needle enter an arm. I was completely traumatized to this day. Every time my grandmother had to inject herself for diabetes, I left the room. And I still look away when I'm getting shot. I just can't. It's not in me. But at the same time, I would say that that's on the negative, but on the positive is that I met some of the most amazing, caring teachers that I've ever encountered in my life, and some of them are still in my life to this day. And I still talk to them like all the time. They are people who introduced books like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I was just talking about it with somebody, like, how we were made to read books that were really creative and ethnic and diverse in those spaces, and how we cherish, how it was so rewarding for us to see ourselves in literature for the first time. And maybe because I was in a school that because I was in a classroom where we were the honors kids, they really honed in on us to try to put us through private schools. So we were made to train to apply to and take the SSAT exam so that we could go to Andover, Phillips Academy, and these privileged schools that would pull us out of our neighborhoods. And some of us survived that and some of us didn't, frankly. But I had been accepted to Andover, but my grandmother didn't understand the importance of that. And so I ended up going to like a local high school. But despite that, I felt that, even in the spaces that I was in, the teachers were so vested in me that I was able to end up in an Ivy League school and et cetera, going on to college. But I would say, at least in New York, I think the transformation of the school system, and I mean, this may sound a little controversial, through Bloomberg and Klein, was so transformative that I do think it made a significant difference, because it drove schools as a marketplace. So if they were popular, they stayed open. If they were not, they closed. And if they were effective, they stayed open. If they were not effective, they closed. And that's really controversial because unions don't want to hear that, and that's very difficult conversation to have politically. But all I can say is that given the high number of Dominicans that are there in that area in New York and how well they've done for themselves financially in terms of educational outcomes, I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I do see that we have significant improvements over time, even for students of color. I still feel like when I look at areas like Prince George's County, we still have so much more to go and still have so much more to learn. Like hiring diversified teachers that the students can identify with, providing culturally sensitive curriculums so Latinos and African Americans can actually feel like they're a part of the process and a part of the curriculum. Right now, they're not. And as a result of that, I think that a lot of our youth feel less grounded here. And if you don't know who you are, where you stand, you're bound to fall for anything and anyone. And that can breed problems in the future. And so I think we want to do better and right by our youth. So I would say that we still have a better way to go. And that's whether parents are still falsifying addresses to send kids to better schools. I think, as you can see, that's since the beginning of time, because I do see that happening consistently, and people do have opportunities here to send their children to private school. We've got several schools here, but it's rare for people to know, especially first generation, to understand how to work that process, so that their child may have a better opportunity to enter into a specialized school and have better options.
Finally, the book focuses on how systemic issues and the grind of trying to get by can keep people trapped in poverty and prevent them from doing better than their parents before them or achieving their American dream. Can you talk a little bit about how access to safe and affordable housing is tied into broader social issues?
Definitely. Here's the thing. I think that and this is a hard question in the sense of like, it's very personal to me, right? Having grown up where I did in Harlem, literally everybody I grew up with is still there. They are still living in the same apartment for the last 60 years. And we're still good for 2 generations deep if somebody were to, die. And it's still rent controlled, and while the apartments there are going for maybe $2,500 a month or more, that to me is exorbitant rents that people are paying. The reality is that my family is in that they're struggling to come up with $700 a month, and that's a problem because, what I see is that people can say, well, living like that is a choice. But the thing is, it's hard to see yourself in a different environment if you've never seen anything else. So if all you see is somebody struggling, like you, living on welfare, like you, getting SSI checks, like you, food stamps, like you, and you live like what I call the 10-block experience. Here it would be the 10-mile experience, and everything in your world is within that 10 blocks. That's what you live. And it took me to literally walk 20 blocks and go from where I grew up to Columbia University, 20 blocks down the street, and say, wow, they've got trash cans. Wow, they've got trees. Wow, they don't have a lot of homeless people on the corners. Wow, they've got clean streets. And when you start to ask the questions, why is somebody invested here and the city's invested here, but not in my neighborhood, not in my building, not in my, main thoroughfare? Then you've got to ask the questions. What's the difference? And when you see the people who are walking the streets, well, my area is Black and brown, and this area is predominantly white, then you recognize what the difference is, and so it does make you think. And it's like, well, if I could enter these spaces, the thing is, some people, it's about not losing yourself in that process, because some people may become malleable. If you don't know who you are, you'll try to fit yourself in to this new white culture that you're entering in so you could better fit there. and try to forget your past. Or you figure out, hey, I know where I'm from. I'm proud of that too. But how can I better able to make that connection between these two worlds, right? And try to elevate the conversation within communities like the ones that I grew up in. And so I would say, at least for me, I'm the type of person that I moved into a community that's similar to the one I grew up in, because I feel that I want to have that conversation and elevate that conversation. And the reason why I didn't do it back home is because even Jesus had to leave Jerusalem to become a prophet. Sometimes if you tell your family what you think they need to do, nobody listens to you. But if a stranger comes in and tells them the exact same thing, they're like, oh, that's a good idea. So that's just the nature of why I decided to sink my roots into Prince George's County, and particularly in the Langley Park area. But I do think that another issue is that with the browning of America, what I see is a complete disinvestment from corporate America and from the way that it used to be, when it was a response to helping Italians and Irish coming out of World War II to kind of fit back in, kind of get themselves elevated and get themselves integrated. Corporate America doubled down on infrastructure, doubled down on unionization, doubled down on everything to contribute heavily to, again, infrastructure, education, all of it. And with the browning of America, there's been a complete disinvestment in that. And I think that as a result of that, this is the first time in the history of this country where we could say that the children are worse off than their parents, because that's truly never happened in the past. That to me is truly sad and should not be.
It definitely is. I want to go back real quick to something that you mentioned about the Irish and the Italian coming back, and unions being a driver of pushing corporate America to invest in infrastructure and sort of paving the path better for those groups. That's a real theme in the book. Her dad is union, and when he loses his place in the union due to his alcoholism, their world sort of crumbles because the union takes care of so much in that community. They take care of the politics, they take care of the jobs, they take care of everything to the degree that things do improve there. How much do you think this is also tied to the labor movement's decline in this country?
Well, again, that's the whole issue. Again, that unions were so strong because unions created that middle class. But with the disinvestment of corporations, taking it abroad and dismantling the unions that existed here. Because you can't really have a union without jobs, right? So that's the thing. As these companies are choosing these tax brackets where they're taking their money outside, when they're looking to do free market development outside the United States.
Pay lower wages outside of the U.S.
Exactly. They're paying lower wages outside of the U.S. I remember when textiles were still in the U.S. I used to work in a sweatshop in New York. And I was talking to, what is that, Senator? His dad was one of the founding members of the textile union in New York. And so unions are super strong because they're the last frontier to having a solid pension for retirement, especially for the poorest of the poor. And without that, I get goosebumps thinking, what's going to happen? Now, like it's interesting you should mention, because I'm actually tackling this very issue in legislation for displaced workers. And this is a 32BJ bill, where we are looking at right now, what we're seeing is that these companies come in through the switching of political administrations, and they'll either kick out everybody and start fresh with lower wages, or keep these people and then find out how the business is actually run through these people. And when it's convenient for them, they'll bring in that other people to train the new slate, kick the people out again to bring in cheaper wages, people with cheaper wages. And to the end of it all, these people may be working here in the county for 30 years with zero pension. They're 65 or almost 70 years old with no pension to name of. And so I'm like, I'm literally floored. And I'm like, if their only saving grace is to receive Social Security, God help us. Because Social Security isn't going to pay anybody's bills, and I've seen and I've encountered situations where a senior woman was abandoned by her 80-year-old husband for whatever reasons it may have been. And they took all the money, and all she had to save herself was $700 a month. And so we had to round up her family, go about this, all kinds of ways to get her new apartment paid off, switch apartments, something so she can afford but it was scary. I mean, a woman that is 80 years old, it's scary. And God help us all. But if we're not preparing to prevent something like that from happening, that'll be us.
It definitely feels like we're swinging back towards not having a safety net, like a social safety net anymore.
Exactly. And that's because these companies don't give a damn. I mean, when you have a company paying $0 in taxes, that's a problem. And when people are doing major money transfers and taxes to the 1%, that's a problem. I mean, I just know that when I did my taxes for the last several years after the Trump tax cuts, I mean, the level of money that I saw going out the window and going into the coffers of the government was just astounding. So it is troubling for me because I do see a lot of systemic issues that are keeping us trapped. And then I'm not going to say that there is a portion of it. I'm not going to deny that there is a portion of it that is mental. But it's kind of programmed. It's like the fly that if you have a fly in the jar and you have a top, and then the fly just gets used to just hitting the top of the cap. But once you take off the cap, the fly doesn't fly out because it's so accustomed. That's the same issue. It's customization. It's, indoctrination, whatever you want to call it. And so it's thinking, how do you get out of that jar? And for me, I think it's experiencing new things, engaging with new folks, and looking at what else is possible. Because I still experience that. I still experience this whole idea of, is it, because I've never seen anybody really, maybe now I've started to meet more people that make over $100,000. But that to me was not real. I never knew a lot of people that made over 100,000. So, and I'm like, if it's not real to folks here, could it be real to, as we elevate, it's like, what about 250? What about 300? What about 500? Have I met somebody that's ever made 600? And that's what I'm talking about, that I just saw a job posting for a salary range from $600,000 to $700,000. And I'm like, who's that? You know what I'm saying? I'm like, I don't know anybody in that. And so and if those are people that walking around those $600,000 circles, God bless them, but I'm like, I want to find out who they are, but I want to do it from here, from Langley Park. And I want to be able to bring those opportunities to Langley Park. The same way we want to do it to every community that's experiencing the same thing. So the same way I want to bring it here, I want to bring it to Suitland, Capitol Heights, District Heights. We want to be able to give those people vision, opportunity.
Right. It feels like a different world, but it shouldn't be a different world for anyone. You should be able to have entry. And yeah, it's interesting to now see this book from the perspective of it almost being a cautionary tale. 100 years ago, you would think, well, we've made so much progress, but are we in danger of falling back to something even, that we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago?
And here's the thing. I mean, I don't know. And I'll tell you that I was reading Freakonomics and, the first edition, and I always, had the suspicion. And then I saw, and, given the fact that I grew up around the crack epidemic, the impact that crack had in our communities. But I remember seeing the documentary on Netflix that just came out. And somebody said, you've got to watch it. You have got to watch it. And I'm like, it was somebody that I respected. And I said, okay, I will. And I just wanted to cry, literally, because the role of the federal government in allowing crack to enter our communities. Basically, I was looking in Freakonomics, they highlight that the African-American Human Development Index, they had that basically all social determinants, health, education, every social determinant for African Americans was on the upswing from the 60s to the height of the 70s. And it's just as it culminated to the highest point it had ever been, then crack hit and everything went down. So we would have been having a different conversation, essentially, had crack not existed in our communities. It just would have been night and day. And I think that's when people start these conspiracy theories. And that when you look at a film like this, when they show and prove the conspiratorial nature of CIA and the federal government in participating essentially in the distribution of crack in the country, it's hard to be able to look and see and say, does America care about Black and brown, in the way it should? And then and even amongst ourselves, there's a book of, I forgot the name of the title of the book, but it basically talks about how we as people of color doubled down and participated in the criminalization of our communities by doubling down on wanting more police, wanting, more stringent, Rockefeller laws, et cetera. And so, and the consequences that happened in terms of disparaging and the disenfranchisement of our voter base. So those are the challenges. I mean, and I think now we're opening up our eyes. Now things are on the upswing, and as long as we stay focused on empowerment, self-determination, I think that we can rise above, but it's not going to be easy, because it never is when you're starting from the bottom and starting your way up.
Well, Councilwoman, I would like to thank you so very much for your time today. This has been a delightful and eye-opening talk, and we really appreciate you being willing to participate in this. And I took way too much of your time, so I apologize for that.
Thank you for inviting me. This was, like I said, this was a heavy topic. But I do think we have to remain optimistic, because I do think that even in light of the things that we read in this book, I do think that if there are still people who care, there's still people who can do, and we all with intentionality can make a difference. So I'd like to leave that on a more positive note than the conversation that we just had. But I want to say thank you for the invitation. Call me back anytime.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too, honey. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this special bonus episode of These Books Made Me. We'll see you next episode.